Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your focus on this subject and on the one-year anniversary of this very tragic crash. We continue to try and get answers and continue to try and come up with policies that we think make sense and that will prevent anything like this from ever happening in the future. So I appreciate the focus and the attention that you've placed on this, and welcome our panels today to the committee. And I guess I would I want to follow up an issue that I've been focused on throughout the course of the hearings that we've had on this subject, and it deals with the whole issue of pilot fatigue. And I know that in the report that that wasn't necessarily what was the factor that was pointed to in this particular incident, but it does seem to me that it's a broader issue with regard to the whole debate about safety. And I guess I'd be interested in hearing from both of you explain how you reconcile the industry and the FAA claim that pilot fatigue and commuting need to be solely the responsibility of individual pilots. It seems to me, at least, that the safety of the passengers, both for regional carriers and large carriers, should be the overriding factor versus self-reporting. And I think it's somewhat alarming that roughly 70% of the Colgan pilots based in Newark commute, and 20% of those pilots commuted from over 1,000 miles away. And so it kind of comes back to what Senator Dorgan was alluding to. But give me your perspective on that, because it seems that the argument that this ought to be solely the responsibility of individual pilots runs clearly in the face of the experience that I think we've had in hearings and in listening to different comment and observations about this throughout the course of this debate.
Senator, we believe, as I think everyone does, that this issue of commuting is quite complex and clearly one that we need to work within the industry to understand and address. The dilemma is there's no easy solution. Someone can drive to National Airport from Fredericksburg, and I don't think any of us would think that was an unreasonable commute, but it can run into several hours. On the other hand, someone can fly from St. Louis to National and be there in an hour, and they've slept the night at home in their own bed, not in a motel. So it's complicated. If we could do it easily, we would have. I do think you'll see in the new rulemaking that we're putting forward that we are asking these kinds of hard questions. How can the government, what is the role of government in this kind of a question? And beyond that, what can the airline and the individual pilot be expected to do and be held accountable to do to perform professionally? But it is a very difficult issue for the government, I believe, to take on, and we're looking at how we could do that.
Senator, I think the issue of fatigue is very complicated. It's not just about commuting. It's about flight and duty time. It's about a medical condition such as sleep apnea. It's about having good policies at a company so that if a pilot is fatigued for whatever reason, they can call in and be taken off duty without punishment. We've investigated accidents in the past where pilots have gotten very little sleep in the night before because they had insomnia or something else was going on, not because of their schedule, but they were nervous about calling in fatigued because they were afraid they would lose their job. And so they flew. They had an overrun on an icy runway, and they made bad decisions. They had gotten 1 hour of sleep in the past 30. And so commuting is one part of this issue, and that's why the Safety Board issued our recommendation following the Colgan accident to the FAA to address this commuting issue, look at scheduling practices. And I think the challenge is it is hard to identify what commute is appropriate or inappropriate, but I have to tell you, I've seen cases where there's a pilot based in Hawaii and they live in Florida. At some point, there are things that kind of go beyond what makes sense for anyone to do. I can tell you that, when I looked at that first officer in the Colgan accident flying from Seattle to Newark on the night before the accident, I feel very uncomfortable having to perform my job, and I don't hold people's lives in my hand, after I've taken a red-eye flight. she had a red-eye flight where she had to stop in Memphis and then had to get back on. And so I think that probably all of us reasonably can say that this commuting is a challenge and it needs to be addressed. And it's going to take the cooperation of the FAA, the industry, and the pilots' unions to try to address it.
What does your sort of, maybe you can, to the extent that you can, comment on your rulemaking, how it contemplates addressing that?
Excuse me, sir. I believe the administrator shared with this committee before that at this point, the rulemaking advisory committee we put together, made up of pilots and the airlines, did not make a recommendation in the area of commuting. They believe that it is a pilot responsibility, and that is the recommendation that they made to the administrator. We will seek additional input into that rulemaking, asking for ideas, ways that whether by regulation or by policy for the airlines and for the pilot, there is materials that we, FAA, should make available. Because as the chairman points out, we don't have a ready solution to this. So we are asking for comment. We're asking for the insights from the industry, both the pilots and the airlines, to see how we might go about addressing this in a reasonable and professional way.
Would the Senator yield on that point?
Yes.
I believe there are some cargo companies that have a ready solution for it, right? I mean, there are cargo companies that have commuting pilots that pay for their motel room when they show up at their duty station the night before the flight. Is that not correct?
There is, I believe, one that does that. There is also a cargo carrier that provides rest facilities at some of their locations that are, temperature controlled and lighting controlled and those kinds of things. So there are some options that have been implemented by some in the industry, and we want to understand those. We want to see how those might be able to be applied more broadly throughout the industry.
Well, it just seems like the example of a pilot who lives in Hawaii and operates out of Florida, it just is a practical matter. Hopefully that's an outlier, but there are, at some point, it seems like practical considerations would come into play here. And I understand there's a balance you have to strike, and you've got to try and find what makes the most sense. But clearly, common sense too would seem to be a consideration here. And absent that being exercised by, and I'm not saying that individual pilots, but I think people push themselves and they do things that they probably shouldn't do and put themselves in situations where they are fatigued, and clearly that's an issue that I think needs to be addressed. And I hope that the process that you're undertaking right now can get at that and perhaps use some of the ways in which the cargo carriers are dealing with these issues as an example of how to best address it. But it seems to me, at least right now, that we've got a problem and it needs to be addressed. So
we agree, sir. And I think to the chairman's point, there is a role for everyone in this: the airline, the pilot, and for the government. And we're trying to understand what those roles and responsibilities, how to best describe those, so that everyone holds each other accountable. The airline should be determining that their crew is competent and ready to fly. The individual pilot should be able to report if he or she is not. The co-pilot or others on the crew should be ready to report if they are concerned that there is a member of the crew who is not ready to take that flight. So there is a role and responsibility here for all of the parties.
okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to